It got so quiet. I mean, that must mean we're going to start. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Matt Cervantes. I'm the Associate Director of Health Programs at Sierra Health Foundation. Really pleased that you all are joining us today for what I know will be a very worthwhile conversation. If it's anything like our speaker's lunch, hold on. It's going to be great. I just wanted to welcome some new faces to the room. We see some of our longtime partners here, and really appreciate you all joining us today. It's also good to see some new faces entering our speaker series. This is our first speaker series of the year. News, media, and politics, what is the new normal? And how timely could this conversation be? I mean, it couldn't be any more timely. For a little bit of background on Sierra Health Foundation, we are a private philanthropy investing in health and well-being across Northern California, increasingly in the San Joaquin Valley. Absolutely focused on what we call the maldistribution of health, recognizing that some communities face barriers to the opportunities to live a healthful life, and that's really where we find and center our grant making and our mission. Would like to welcome one of our board members here, Trey Washburn, and his wife, Marion, joining us today for the speaker series. We are a tight-knit group here, and it's always good to see our organizational leadership present. So for those that are familiar with our speaker series, we bring in thought leaders and really the brightest minds from across the country to come and talk about certain issues. And today is no different. Because there has been such focus on the media, really, the last couple of years, we have some award-winning journalists that are working inside and with media today, who will talk about some of their experiences and observations through their work. We would invite those who are on social media today to be present using the hashtag SHF Speaker Series. It's a singular speaker series, and to recognize that we are also live streaming today's event all across the state of California. So there are people watching from the comfort of their computer, and then this will also be posted to Sierra Health Foundation's YouTube channel and our website shortly after the event. In terms of some logistics, we will be taking Q&A based on time. We do have a hard stop today at 3 p.m. Some of our speakers and panelists need to catch their transportation home quickly after the event. But there should be blue cards or blue pieces of paper at your chair. Please, if you do have questions, fill them out, hand them to staff who will be coming in and out of the aisles at the designated time, and you can hand it to them and they will help queue up some of the questions during that session. All right, just making sure I took care of all my responsibilities as your MC today. With that, I would like to turn the reins over to Diane Littlefield. She is a member of our executive team, Vice President of Programs and Partnerships, who will be serving as moderator today, and she'll be introducing our panelists. Diane.
All right, well, thank you, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. It's delightful to see all of you here. Beautiful afternoon by the river. So it is my distinct pleasure to serve as your moderator for this distinguished panel. And this afternoon's forum is designed to gain insights into how news content is packaged and distributed on different channels and the degree to which news content influences public opinion and attitudes on issues of the day. So no lack of conversation there. And as Matt mentioned, we had a very lively lunch discussion, and I hope to hear from the panelists on many of the issues that they brought forward. But to set up our panel discussion, I want to make a few observations about the ever-changing media landscape. And first of all, as you know, news cycles are instantaneous. We live in a 24/7 news environment that sets the pace and defines the settings of how news is disseminated. And according to the Pew Research Center, today adults prefer getting most of their news on a screen. TV remains dominant, but digital news consumption is rising rapidly, as we know, and the percentage of adults who get news on mobile devices is particularly on the rise. It's also important to note that social media news consumers will still get their news from other sources, especially local TV news, but nearly twice as many adults get news online than in print, and younger adults are especially likely to turn to the web for their news, while older Americans rely heavily on TV for their news. Only about 2 in 10 adults trust the information they get from local news organizations, whether it's online or offline, and only 18% say the same of national organizations. But large majorities say they have at least some trust in both. And only 4% of web-using adults trust the information they get on social media, and just 34% say they have at least some trust in this source. So now, with that background, sorry, I'd like to introduce our distinguished panelists. And I'll start on my right, and I'd like to start with Linnea Edmeyer, who is the managing editor for news and information for Capital Public Radio, Sacramento being your home. So, Linnea oversees and coordinates news content for the station, both on air and online, and previously she produced the afternoon newscasts for KGO, ABC Radio in San Francisco, overseeing story coverage, managing breaking news, and her experience also includes documentary, film, and photography, and you may have seen her work in the PBS Ken Burns documentary, Prohibition. Linnea has earned multiple industry accolades, including the Associated Press Mark Twain Awards and a National Edward Murrow Award for Breaking News. Welcome, Linnea.
Thank you.
To Linnea's right is Thomas Peel, having worked for newspapers for 34 years, half in California and half on the East Coast. Thomas Peel today is an investigative reporter for the Mercury News and the East Bay Times. He recently won a Pulitzer Prize for breaking news of the horrific Ghost Ship fire in Oakland. Thomas has won more than 60 journalism awards, widely considered one of the state's leading advocates and thought leaders on government transparency and access. And Thomas is the author of Killing the Messenger, which is about the 2007 murder of Oakland journalist Chauncey Bailey. He is also a lecturer at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome, Thomas. To his right, Tremayne Lee, a national reporter for NBC News, MSNBC. Tremayne offers reporting and analysis online and on air on such issues as race, poverty, gun violence, and politics. He led the network's coverage of high-profile cases, including the killing of Michael Brown Jr. and the fallout in Ferguson. Previously, Tremayne was a reporter at the Huffington Post, where he broke the story of Trayvon Martin. He also has been a reporter at a number of other news organizations, including the New York Times, where he contributed to the Pulitzer Prize-winning coverage of Governor Eliot Spitzer's sex scandal, and the Times-Picayune in New Orleans, where he shared a Pulitzer Prize as part of a team that covered Hurricane Katrina. Tremayne is a fellow with New America Foundation and currently working on a book on the true costs of gun violence in America. Welcome, Tremayne.
Thank you.
And to his right, Diane Ruiz. Diane has reported for independent media outlets in the U.S., Canadian mainstream, and ethnic media, and the largest daily newspaper in the Philippines currently. In 2012, she co-founded the San Francisco-based nonprofit People Power Media to report on community efforts to impact public policy. Diane has also worked in politics in the San Francisco area. Welcome, Diane. Okay. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel. So I have the pleasure of offering some gentle questions to begin with, and
These are reporters; they don't need to be gentle.
and then knowing our conversation from lunch, I know that you will offer some incredibly dynamic insights and thoughts, share your experiences, and we will then follow that by Q&A from the audience. Okay. So to begin with, just to start our conversation, just starting with a simple question, given the complexities of our time, the ever-changing environment, how in your mind does an idea turn into a story? When you package the story, what are the critical ingredients you look for to make it newsworthy?
I'll start.
Okay.
It's not fair you filled us up with tuna salad and ravioli before we start. For me, in my work, I cover that kind of sweet spot between life and death in America and how we live and how we die. And sadly, we live and die in completely different ways. And so I try to look for those stories that are at the flux of that, right? How are the systems that guide our lives and govern us, how are they failing us? How are they succeeding us? But for me, it's always about the ground level, the voices that aren't heard. And it's almost cliche in journalism to give voice to the voiceless, but as we know, that sometimes the noise gets so loud that it kind of mutes the voices of the people. Especially when you're talking about our most marginalized communities, those that have been depleted, disinvested in throughout the course of our history. And so for me, when there's that combination of a strong narrative, obviously you want a character because it's easier for people to understand a character than the big systemic issues sometimes, right? If you have the young man who's been, ground through the criminal justice system and from his birth on has been chipped away at by the systems and society, find that vehicle to bring us into the story, and then we can step back. Because I think so often, we talked about this over lunch, the other, right? And our country is so tribal, right? So protective of our peoples and our resources, sometimes violently so, to the point that we don't, recognize that, especially when it comes to racism and segregation and white supremacy in America, it was intentionally formed and intentionally maintained to this day, sometimes violently so. And so it's easy to get lost in all of that, especially when you're privileged and you benefit from the white supremacy and the subjugation and oppression of whole swaths of people. But so how can we find, going back to that idea of a sweet spot, that sweet character, how can we find someone or some issue that touches the humanity in us all? Which isn't always easy because we think we've heard the story about the wrongfully convicted person. We think we've heard the story of the young man wrongfully convicted of some sort of shooting or killing, or the unarmed black teenager shot by the police. But every story matters. And so for me, once we get into that space, to simplify things, that it's about life and death in America and how systems fail us, for me, that's what I look for in a story.
Thank you for that, Tremayne. Well, now let me ask you, because you're a decision maker at Capital Public Radio, about what actually goes online. Yeah. So how are those decisions made? What do you look for?
Yeah, actually, I was interested in what Thomas was going to say. Yeah. I'm going to answer that question because, because we have a little bit of a different, beat or different ways we approach stories. So I was really, before I answer, I'd like to hear what Thomas, how he what makes a story work for him, or what it is.
They said 34 years, which is correct. And for about half of that, I've had this title of investigative reporter, but every reporter is really an investigative reporter, or else they're not doing their jobs. I get a long time to work on stories. And as things change, that changes a little bit, but I still get a fair amount of time. So I look for things that have been unreported. Sounds very simple, but the first three letters of news spell new. So I look for something new that hasn't been reported before. An example of that is, you may all recall that about 2 years ago, there was a woman who was shot on a pier in San Francisco. Her name was Kate Steinle, and she died. She was shot by a guy who had come into the country 4 or 5 times without documentation. Someone doing that shooting, coming in the country by illegal means, that wasn't necessarily new. What was new to me and something I seized on was the fact that the gun he used had been stolen days earlier from a federal law enforcement agent who had left it in a vehicle parked on a San Francisco street. So something that I spent months and months working on was, how many times does a cop have a gun stolen in California? And it turned out to be a lot. I found, really without looking, I traced out 955 guns. And then an editor said, you know what, write the damn story now. Which they tend to do sometimes.
Yeah, I was just going to say, that's kind of where I come in.
But that was something that no one had done before. So that's the kind of thing, stepping back off a news event, that I want to do. I want to give you, as a consumer of news, something that you didn't know. And it turns out that in a lot of police departments, a cop getting a gun stolen is sort of the company secret. They may get chastised inside, but that's not anything that they're going to crow about at all. So, in that sense, when I've got the time to work on something, that's the kind of story I want to do. There are other times, like the ghost ship fire in Oakland back in December, where, I just saw what happened without even talking to an editor. I just went to the office and started working, because there I take investigative reporting skills and how much can I do today, now, right now, it's going to go online maybe in 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And I was able to do that with some very simple things at the beginning. Who owned the building? What was it zoned for? Well, it wasn't zoned for parties. It wasn't zoned as an event space. So immediately there, we, a couple of colleagues and I started down a path of reporting on this that was one of the several reasons that we won a Pulitzer Prize for that coverage. So can kind of go either way. Sometimes the news dictates what you do. Sometimes you can find a story.
This is so exciting to me. I'm listening as if I'm not part of this process, because it is, for those of us that continue to do this, there is some excitement to it. I can't describe what that is, but there is some excitement to it. So to answer your question, I think we have to go back, and something Thomas said, the editor said, fine, write it. And that's sort of where I come in. I hear what the reporters bring back, and I think something you said about how is this new? Where's the sweet spot? Where's the part that's going to actually be something different than what we've heard before? That's part of it, because we hear so many stories. But where is the part that's going to connect the dots for our audience? Where is the part that's going to bring out something that we didn't know before about the particular story, the tracing the gun, right? That was something that when I hear something like that from a reporter, I recognize that for our audience, that's going to be connecting the dots in a completely different way. It's not just going to tell the small story. It's also going to open up the story to what affects us, not necessarily, it's not the daily, how am I going to get to work kind of story and what's affecting my day, but these are the organizations, these are the systems in place, and these are the kinds of things that reporters and the media, this is part of our job, is to sort of uncover this and help our audience connect the dots in a lot of these stories.
Well, thank you for that. Let me ask you, Diana, as the co-founder of your company, People Power Media, what drives you in the decision-making on what stories to highlight and select?
Well, reporting out of San Francisco, you could probably report on a protest every day of the week if that was what you wanted to do. So we have to go beyond that. We look at community efforts to impact public policy. So we're looking at communities that have a solution that aren't, that solution isn't being reported on as much in the mainstream news. So we look at also what's not being covered. And we really want to have a way for people to understand a way to move forward from the problem. We want to make sure that we interview people that are directly impacted. If it's a tenant, if it's a staff of a nonprofit, we look to those people as experts on that topic. So we take a little bit of a different approach rather than interviewing a policymaker or a academic. So we look at those different perspectives, as well as ways that communities are putting forward their own solutions, and also if it's timely to, if there's a legislation that's coming up, so that we don't directly advocate for that legislation for or against, but at least there is a way that someone can act on that perspective if there is a hearing coming up. So we try and make it timely for that as well.
Thank you for that. So the job of journalists has changed. I think you both alluded to that. And so how do you see the job of journalism changing, especially given the times of today? And what ways are the rules of journalism changing in response to the changing times? So how is journalism changing?
You know, everything has changed. The way we report, when we report, especially coming from being a print reporter. You know, I said we were putting stuff online 5 minutes into reporting on the Ghost Ship fire, almost minute by minute. I was doing reporting that, you know, in the old days, that would have been maybe the second day story. Now it's an editor saying, can you put 3 paragraphs about that online? So technology, we were talking a lot about this at lunch, Twitter, social media, everything has changed. But also, nothing has changed because the Constitution hasn't changed. Our rights to go out and be independent gatherers of facts haven't changed. Those words, Congress shall make no law, still apply to what journalists do. It allows Mr. Lee to go out and walk through Ferguson, Missouri, and talk to people. It allows me to go knock on doors of firemen at night, trying to catch them at home because we think that maybe they know something that we need to know, or perhaps we're going to ask them about some mistakes that they might have made in events leading up to that fatal fire, why they had knowledge of what the interior of that building was like but didn't report it. So how we do things changes a lot. Why and what enables us to do things, I think that's pretty consistent.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I think has changed, you know, I've been a journalist for about 15 years now. And in the beginning, one of the most important things was equal time, right? If someone says that the trash isn't being delivered on time, you go to the city and just have them rebuke whatever they were saying. You have a Democrat, have a Republican. You have someone on one side of the racial line, you have to have someone else. And that was kind of where the bar was. And that was what fair was. I think we've evolved now, we're sophisticated enough to see things in their proper perspective. And we've been challenged by that, clearly, with the election of Donald Trump. In how do we frame this? Do we call it a lie? Do we say it short of the truth? How do we actually address, patently false things that people say? How do we properly frame, say if it's a Ferguson, Missouri, the history of violence that's been perpetrated on people, how municipalities are booing their budgets on the backs of the most marginalized people in the community? How do we frame that without just saying, this person said this and this person said that? I think partly because of the advent of social media, where we're getting more voices, people are chiming in, and so we're getting closer to the truth than before I think we were, because we were simply relying on equal sides. Mm-hmm. I think that's, for me, a way we've changed, because I can go to a community and say, well, here's actually what's happening, and give some context without simply relying on equal sides. And I think that's kind of changed the game a lot for me, at least.
We talk a lot about transparency now, right? We try to be objective, and yet we know, and we talk a lot about this, there is bias in reporting. No matter, as much as you try to be objective, there's always going to be bias in reporting. So how can we be more transparent in our reporting? So I know that's one thing that's the language that has changed, but we still go out and ask the tough questions. I mean, that's part of the reporting that doesn't change. The other thing that I think is starting to influence journalism as well is, as we all have mentioned, the internet allowed anybody to be online and to distribute whatever they wanted to distribute, right? So you've got this platform for mass distribution without the editors, without any. So we have all that information. So that's sort of brought advocacy into the realm of journalism. Mm-hmm. So whereas people that are hard news reporters, we try to be transparent, we try to be objective, and yet we recognize that there are some, people who are calling themselves journalists that are actually advocates. Mm-hmm. And so how do we balance that in the newsroom when we know that there are stories we want to do? How do we keep from falling all the way over into advocacy? How do we help our listeners understand and connect the dots and ask the questions, and yet we know we need to remain transparent. We know we come with our own set of bias. Mm-hmm. So that's that's been a challenge in the newsroom, and we've had some very difficult conversations in our newsroom about how to cover a particular story. What language do we use? What words do we use? What words do we not use? A guest that's going to be on, somebody who's, peppering our emails with a particular story. So I'm proud to say that in our newsroom, we do have very difficult conversations about this.
Yeah. I think with People Power Media, what we try and do is kind of provide an overall balance in kind of the public discussion. So one of the things that you're taught in journalism school, it could be 50-50 or it could be, 80-20. A lot of the time you hear kind of the opposing view towards the end of an article or towards the end of the story, and that's kind of like one clip or one quote from somebody that thinks differently. And so kind of seeing that model, what we try and do is try and elevate for 80% of the story someone that doesn't get heard as much, and kind of make them the expert. If you're talking about a teacher who's homeless, her story gets to be the one that's the expert testimony, the one that gets filled as far as kind of creating the base of our story. So we kind of trying to look at it in a holistic way, and it's because we're an independent news organization. I think obviously if I was working for a daily newspaper or a radio show where I would have a responsibility to report more broadly, it would be a different conversation, but that's what we try and do with People Power Media. And as far as changes in the way that media is evolving, even though we as an independent news organization have gotten a lot of distribution and success from social media and Facebook, it's really scary to me to see the rise of Facebook as a main distribution hub for journalism. I think it's 44% of Americans get their news from Facebook. It's good to, they do get it from other sources, but it's increasingly consolidated. And, you look at kind of media consolidation as having like the big six, news organizations where it used to be, dozens before, and now it's six, and you kind of look at it, is Facebook and Twitter just the one or two, when, you're getting kind of hoping to get a one-stop shop, but then you're not a lot of people are realizing that the algorithm is really influencing what you're seeing, and you're not really getting the full picture, and unless you take the step to actually go to the sources that you trust, you're not actually getting, the real stories that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
Can I chime into something she said?
Please.
One thing I like the idea of this 80-20, because I think for so long, we haven't centered the experience of the people that we're writing about. So it's easy to fall back on a PR person who is paid to lie to you, or a politician who is going to spin the facts, as opposed to going down to the ground and talking to that student, and talking to that officer, talking to whoever it is that's closest to the experience. And for some reason, again, I don't know if it's journalistic laziness, or we know we're going to get a good soundbite, or we know we can just call them up and we know they're going to give us something, as opposed to going to the community and going to the people who are actually impacted. And not to say that's revolutionary, but sometimes we don't do that.
We didn't do that for so long as an industry. I think we got away from that. And now that we know that this is where we need to go back, I think a lot of organizations are scrambling to figure that out, right? The idea that you can parachute in, get the story you need, and get out. Communities are saying, not anymore.
Right.
I know we've spent a significant amount of our attention on community engagement, which is defined differently for all organizations. But for us, it means for our longer, in-depth pieces, we will spend a year researching, meeting with community organizations, meeting with policymakers and community advocacy groups. And we will spend a year researching the stories and convening with them before we start doing our reporting. And those are for our longer form stories, but simply for that reason, like we just can't drop in and think we are going to know the story. We need to have some
And it shows. That's
background.
why people don't trust us, because when they read a story, they see it on TV, it just doesn't sound right.
No.
So just turn on TV and something doesn't ring true to the story. It doesn't feel not necessarily authentic, but you could tell they're just, giving you this canned idea of what it is. And we've seen it on both sides of the aisle, why people do not trust us, because you haven't spent any time here. There's been a lot of criticism about, the journalists on the coast. But the truth is, how many people have been in some of these small communities, these white evangelical communities? How many people are in these small towns? How much time and energy and resources do we direct to those places that we already have written off as whatever they are? And that's part of the problem when you're talking about, Appalachia or Camden, New Jersey. That's the problem.
Yeah. Or 40 minutes from here,
Right.
40 miles from here. That was a revelation for some people in my organization. To recognize that on the night of the election, that we have folks in our backyard here in Sacramento who, that is 60% went Republican. Didn't shock me. I live there. But for a lot of people in the organization, it was a surprise. So I think the idea that we don't get out there, we don't know the communities, we don't trust them, I think that's, for organizations who are finding that they're still able to do good work, this is something I think they've understood and they've kept doing. Trying to do everything through your social media it's not going to last. So I think we also got into the discussion at lunch about media literacy and how do you take in what you're seeing and make your own editorial decisions as a viewer, as a listener, as a reader. And then where is the responsibility on the organization to, how do we help people understand what that means? And, the spokesperson, we were joking about that too, the advent of the spokesperson, who is that firewall between the reporter and the person they really need to talk to, who's going to have, the hard
and the
facts.
Truth.
And the truth, yeah.
The truth.
Yeah, so this is so it's, it's a great challenge actually, because it really brings out the strongest parts of the reporters and forces them to really, get to the heart of what the story really is.
Yeah, thank you for that. So speaking of President Trump's Twitter storms, or alluding to them, it really has been a game changer for how the White House engages the public. And you began talking about this, but if you could say more about how these online tools, Facebook being a major community engagement tool, how these online tools are forcing you in the media industry, radio, TV, print, to report differently, events and topics in a different way. And you started this, like having to go out and meet with folks. And so if you could say more about specifically what you're doing to address that.
There's obviously different ways we can use social media. For breaking stories, one of the things we were doing for the Asiana plane crash in San Francisco airport. So it's a good way. Sometimes you can filter information quickly, but you've got to, you can't just jump on everything you see. You've got to filter. Or if there's, I remember a vehicle went into a restaurant, I think in Palo Alto. We couldn't get a reporter there within 10 or 15 minutes, but I could get online and I could kind of triangulate where it was happening, and I could call the restaurants. I had Google Maps up. I could call the restaurants around there to find out what was going on. Was there anybody else involved? Was it just a vehicle? So you begin to source stories sometimes. And I think we were talking about this, right? Wasn't it Ferguson that that you first started to see inklings of this? And this is where really good reporters know how to use these online tools. We know, we're beginning to understand that we can use them for the better of our stories. And that's a great story.
I think
You've got to tell that.
it goes both ways. So on August 9th, 2014, my sister was actually getting married, and I'm from South Jersey, down by Camden, so I was down there for the wedding. And my Twitter feed started to blow up with talk of something happening in Ferguson. And then you see the body of the young man in the street for the first hour, for the second hour, for the third hour, for the fourth hour, baking beneath the sun. You saw the crowds gathering. You saw the Quick Trip gas station go up in flames. You saw the protests in the streets. And this is all like the first day and a half, 2 days. And so by Monday morning, I gave my editor a call. It was about 5 or 5:30 in the morning. I said, something's happening out in Missouri. I think I should get out there and just to make sure, because it seems like things are literally and figuratively kind of heating up. And so by the time I got out there, this was before any news cameras were out there besides the locals. And that Monday night, it got worse. Tuesday night, you started to see the police arriving with armored vehicles with snipers on top of the roofs. They started shooting tear gas and rubber bullets for infractions such as throwing a plastic water bottle at one of their trucks. I literally was about 20 to 25 feet away from one of these armored vehicles with a sniper on the roof, and I saw literally a water bottle fly through the sky, hit the armored vehicle, and they said, this is no longer a peaceful disturbance. You must not evacuate, you must leave the area now. Within seconds, rubber bullets and tear gas. This was the response to protests of a young man being killed under questionable circumstances, legally justified or not, his body baking beneath the sun, uncovered for 4 hours, with children and mothers and families in this community that had already weathered so much, which we would learn later from a Department of Justice report that, the abuses heaped upon the black community in this space were tremendous. But again, the first inkling of what was happening was Twitter, right? It was social media. Night after night, I might have stayed for a month and a half, 2 months, almost straight, except for my daughter's birthday, August 20th, so I had to get home for that. I told him, I said, I'm going home. My baby was turning 2 years old. But quickly went back out there, and it got to the point where if people didn't see me tweet for an hour, Tremayne, are you okay? Are you all right? So it was actually a tremendous tool, one, for news and information, but also you start to see this new generation of activists, right, using social media, not just to talk, not just from the armchair, but they were organizing. There was this day of action, I think it was in November, a week or two before the grand jury decided not to indict the police officer, where you didn't know what was going to happen up until a minute, and they were shutting a Walmart down. They were shutting a highway down. The action, and this is, thousands of young people taken to the streets using this tool that we didn't have when we were coming up. Now, on the complete flip side, we've seen Donald Trump and his Twitter fingers at work, right? Time and again, he's invoked Chicago as this kind of, whipping post. There are bullets flying everywhere. People are being killed. It's like a war zone, lacking any humanity in this. So I teamed up with Chris Hayes for his show All In, and we launched a series on trauma. Okay, we got one down and we're working on the second one. But, we projected, here's what Donald Trump, here's what the president is projecting about the situation in Chicago. But let's go to the ground and show you what's happening and what trauma is, right? It's one thing to talk about the bodies, the wounds that you can see, those, who are wounded and paralyzed, or the tally we like to keep, right? We like to keep a tally of the dead, 752, 600, 200. But what about the wounds you don't see? The wounds that never heal, right? And this goes back to the idea of centering the experiences of those who lived it. Let's have a trauma-informed approach, the way many of your organizations might approach. Let's arrive at this place, understanding the historical trauma. One, the guy named Selwyn Rogers, he's a trauma surgeon who's opening the first level 1 trauma center on the South Side in over 30 years, which is amazing because all of the shootings and killings happen on the South and West Side. And he said, there's no such thing as post-traumatic stress. This is present traumatic stress, right? Dealing with the pangs of segregation and isolation and economic decimation, right? They're dealing with this every single day, so it's not something post that you emerge from. It's ongoing, right? And traumatized people further that cycle of trauma because you turn to weapons for protection. You turn to drugs and alcohol to numb it. You start keeping your children indoors, right? And so it's this cycle. So this, Mr. President, this is what's happening in Chicago. But we get that platform because he's so active on social media, right? We get to do that and then we hinge it to that news. Okay, here's what you're projecting, but here's what's actually happening on the ground. So there's both sides on a big 30,000-foot view of social media, right? Well, let's turn it back around and fact check things, right? And then there's on the ground, logistically gathering information as a reporter. Here's what's happening. And it's also just amazing, again, how young people are using social media as a tool, for advocacy and protest.
Mm-hmm. When you break down what we're actually talking about, I would not say we, journalists, but it's very easy to dismiss Twitter, right? Very easy to dismiss what you say on Facebook. But you've got to remember, these are statements from the President of the United States. These aren't just tweets. These are statements from the President. And when you begin to think about them in that context, you've got to put that in context, right? You've got to be thinking like that. Just as when a journalist puts something on Twitter, that's an act of journalism. I think you said that at lunch.
That's right.
And so it's the medium is no longer simply this is what I had for lunch. You are committing an act of journalism. This is a statement from the President of the United States. So.
And let me just say this about the President and Twitter. In the 90s, for 7 years, I was a reporter in Atlantic City, where I dealt with him on a regular basis, at least a couple of times a week, especially when he was working to undermine efforts of anybody else to come in and own a casino. And you know what, folks? what I saw is what we've all got now. He is the exact same person that he was then. He just didn't have I can't imagine what he would have done if he had a Twitter account then, some of the things that he did, some of the political skullduggery that he clandestinely paid for through his longtime friend Roger Stone, who's wrapped up in the Russia stuff and also has this Netflix documentary out about him now that I haven't watched yet. But, it's a cliche, but he shoots from the hip. He says whatever is going to further his cause at the moment, regardless of substance. He was mean and vindictive. And if you'd said to me in 1997, hey, in 20 years, this guy's going to be president of the United States, I would have laughed and thought it would be impossible. What I think he doesn't realize in his use of Twitter and the way that he throws out these things that can't be factually verified, like being bugged by President Obama. Hopefully, he's waking people up now to this unfiltered access to his thinking. Because if you have dealt with him a little bit, one, it's not new, and two, it's frightful.
Well, just to add to that, just the flip side that's part of what makes him so popular to a lot of people is the fact that it's unfiltered and they feel like they're getting access to him in a way that that wasn't available before for a president. And I've seen an article, for example, that called President Obama the YouTube teleprompter president versus Trump as the Twitter president. And so that's kind of the contrast of, is that politician just giving me the lines that someone else wrote for them, the gatekeeper wrote for them. They're not being genuine. They're just telling me what I want to hear. It's horrifying what Trump is doing, but that's definitely part of the appeal of why it's creating this popularity of him, that access. It almost doesn't matter, to him or to his base. What he says is just the fact that he's doing it and creating that access that makes him somebody that they want to support.
Facebook's changed algorithms, we've talked a little bit about Facebook, to reduce fake news posts, and Wall Street Journal's developed red and blue feeds of the same topic on Facebook. So how do news organizations staffed by professional journalists ensure information being shared by third parties are accurate and balanced?
That's a tough one, but
how do you determine a news source is credible?
yeah, I think, well, I have to say my BS detector is world class. It's one thing I think as a journalist, you begin to trust your gut on these things. So that's the first part. Again, we go back to media literacy. It's having to dig a little bit, and I think that's one of the things that's happened with the internet lately. And there's two sides on that, of course. Young reporters, green reporters. Sometimes I have to remind them, call whoever it is who's not calling you back. Did you go to their office? Did you knock on the door? Did you sit in the waiting room? How long did you wait for them? This kind of thing, because they could pick up the phone or the internet. But the internet's allowed us to sort of dig after those sources. I call it going down the rabbit hole, right? How far are you going to go down that rabbit hole, checking on that source, vetting that source? And then are you going to pick up the phone and call? And then are you going to go search some records? So as far as sourcing or, do we trust what another outlet says? There's a lot of vetting that goes on before we will, say it's credible. Mm-hmm. I think that's also one of the reasons why we decide to collaborate with other organizations. We know that if we have a particular story we want to do and we have limited time and limited reporters to work on it, if we can partner with another agency that we, align with and we find credible, sometimes we can get a lot more reporting done. But it really does come down to the veracity of your vetting. Mm-hmm.
I think part of the problem is that you're dealing with It's almost like what people say about America or criminal justice system. Is it broken or is it working the way it's designed to work? It's a serious question. So when you look at what's happening with social media, it's designed to give you exactly what you want when you want it. If you start looking up leather boots, your Gmail, you're gonna see the little ads for leather boots, right? They're listening and watching. So you're fighting against people's natural impulses, their political impulses. You're fighting against something that is so intricately designed, right? And more and more of the fabric of our daily lives. So how do you break through that? How do you break through these false narratives when it reinforces every myth that you had about life since you were 5, about race or class or gender or coast or education? Right? When they're penetrating, it's like a direct tap into your vein. How do we fight against that? And that's the scarier part. And working for NBC and MSNBC, I see it in cable news. Look what's become, right? It's shifting now. You had Fox and you had Obama, and it had to be a counterbalance, and the MSNBC had to arrive to fight that. And now that's going. We've hired Megyn Kelly and Fox. It's all this shifting, trying to make sure you give the people what they want and reinforcing their notions of life as it is. And I think that's where we're still going to have to wrestle with, and we're challenged with, how do we decode this? How do we frame life as truthfully as possible and cut through that noise? But it's hard when it's on your pocket, right? And it's difficult.
And it's hard when the instances that you got to do it immediately.
Right.
You got to do it faster than it's ever been done in the history of the profession. It's that's part of the challenge. That's part of the great challenge.
And recognize the consequences.
Right.
I mean, now more than ever, we see what can happen when we allow this kind of unfestered.
Yeah.
I think it's easy also in a 24-hour news cycle to just, cite the original publishing source and then create a story right away so that you can create that story in 5 minutes instead of actually going to interviewing that police chief and seeing actually what happened. You just quote that New York Times reported that police chief said this, and this is really what happened. And I think also as people, consumers of media, I saw a study that said that nearly 60% of people don't actually read what they retweet or what they share on Facebook. It was one of those medias. So it was, kind of, when you kind of dig in deeper to the study, they actually say, well, actually, if you read, the more of the article that you read, the more likely you are to tweet. So there's basically two extremes of you either read every single word of the article or you read none of it and then you shared it and retweeted it. So I think there's also that responsibility as a consumer and a distributor yourself to kind of know what you're reading, vet it for yourself. Does it seem credible?
And I think credibility is the one thing as reporters, at least I feel like that is the one thing I have that I cannot let go of. And sometimes that sometimes weighs on me enough where I will make a decision and then think, did I make that right? Was that the right decision to make? And we're also talking about video too. And in the last 6 months, I would say video is coming through faster. For example, if you've got, here in Sacramento, I'm sure you're all familiar probably with it wasn't too long ago, the jaywalker and the video from the inside of the car came first, and it was a snippet. And the question, can we put this up? And I'm like, I have no idea if this was the car, we just can't go like that with it. So there's also this editorial decision that has to happen as well when we think, do we want to be first or do we want to be right? And am I making an editorial decision here by omitting something? Because omitting something is also a decision. Putting something in or omitting is also a decision. And then the police now have figured out that they better release their video ASAP, because this sitting on their video for a week or two anymore is not cutting it with them either. So that's changed here in the last 6 months as well.
This idea, though, of credibility, before we were armed with credibility.
Yeah. Totally.
But there's been an active war against us. We are the enemy of the people, right? So when you diminish the gatekeeper, you have other media organizations rising. InfoWars has a seat at the table now.
Don't call them media. Just call them entertainment.
Performance
art. He called himself performance art.
But that's just for the lawsuit. The idea that a Sandy Hook hoaxer has some standing in this community. So now the gatekeeper has changed. That's credibility now.
Yeah.
So now, that changes the entire game. And we are in this kind of Twilight Zone world where it's like, what is the truth? The truth isn't the truth anymore, right?
I have a very good friend who is a Trump supporter, voted for Trump. He's a police officer. He's got a young daughter who has health problems. He's got all the issues that any of us would have. And so we have these very lively discussions, like, how do you wrestle with that? How do you actually find that credible? And this word comes up a lot. And I thought it was interesting that, his one response to my question about, how do you square yourself with all of this? And he says, I just want my news, I want my news organization, my media, to not put their own bias into the reporting.
They want his bias instead.
Well, that's what that was my question. That was my next question, but I thought that was interesting. This is somebody who actually doesn't live here in Sacramento, but reads what most people would agree to is a liberal paper every day. And I thought that was kind of interesting that you would read that paper every day, even, kind of struggling against that. But where else are you getting your information? Where are you getting the information that you're calling credible? So,
Hang on, just one thing. You mentioned Sandy Hook. I mean, the people who believe it's a hoax, you can't appease them. You can't. But here's what's frightening. There was a letter that was sent to the vice president, signed by a whole boatload of sheriffs, and there's a lot of sheriffs in America because there's a lot of counties. On the hoax issue, elected officials, people who were voting in the office, believe that Sandy Hook was just a made-up thing to attack the NRA. That is just mind-boggling to me. So there we get in, go back to the whole media literacy thing. There's a larger systematic failure going on when people can campaign on that, and because it's what somebody wants to hear, because they think that the jackbooted thugs are going to come and take their guns away tomorrow, that they will vote for people like that, giving this thing credibility. It's like Trump and the whole birther thing with the president. The foreign-born terrorist, building his base on that. And then he's got the audacity to get all upset on Twitter because his son may have seen the severed head thing. You think Barack Obama's daughters didn't see, for years, these terrible allegations against their parents? That their father's a terrorist? That their mother's a man? I mean, it just...
Well, the word credibility comes up a lot, and we know that ratings and shareholder returns they're still major drivers, right, of influencing how news gets packaged. Can you talk a little bit about what role these factors play in the way news is reported? And then in terms of, do you believe or news organizations are focusing enough on underrepresented communities?
Two really good questions. We could spend the whole time on those questions.
And let me say,
we're probably getting
we have about, I think, 10, 15 minutes. If you have questions, please write them on your blue card, and then they'll be moving down, and Amy's going to be collecting them. So, sorry, I want to give that little plug.
No, that's okay. So, two questions.
Two big questions.
Two big questions. I'll go with the first part. I feel like I'm on a game show. I'll go with the first one very quickly. So the ability to read analytics now, I wouldn't say influences what we do. We still want to do good, solid reporting, but it gives us an idea of who our audience is and what they're looking at. It isn't going to make an editorial. It isn't going to change an editorial decision, but it's going to allow me, when I look at it, to understand what is keeping their attention online. What do they want more of? Are they going through my 800 to 1,200 word story, and are they getting to the end? Because if they are not getting to the end, what is it that we're not doing to help them understand? Or if they are getting to the end, okay, this is great because this tells me they want more of this. They understand. We're able to help them connect the dots through our longer pieces. That's a little bit of how the analytics work, I think, in a positive way. On the opposite side, they could work in a negative way because some organizations can say, we need X amount of clicks to keep our advertisers happy. So you, reporter there, that you've been working on that really great investigative piece, put that aside for a week. I need you to do 3 listicles that are going to come out on Friday before the weekend because we need our clicks. Okay, that's the negative side, I think. And we don't go that direction. I think the bigger topic here is probably the inclusive reporting that you're talking about. And this has been a topic for the last few years, I would say, And media organizations are really, they're wrestling with this idea, like how do we bring diversity into the newsroom, but how do we also bring it into our reporting? And I think for a while it was, the diversity in the newsroom came in the form of, let's get some boxes checked and make sure we have some people from different races in our newsroom, different backgrounds, different races. But I think as we're longer into this discussion, we've realized that diversity comes in all forms, including socioeconomic diversity. And so I think the broader we expand the definition of what inclusive reporting is, I think that's when we are starting to get at the heart of the stories and the characters that we need. Mm-hmm. We're beginning to understand that we have to have people in our newsroom who can understand those experiences and talk about those experiences and go to those communities and be able to have meaningful conversations, not just a question and answer period, like, tell me about your story, and wow, that's really interesting, I didn't know anything about that, but people who can go in and actually have the time to spend in those and have some background knowledge or understanding of what's happening in the communities. And then I mentioned before our idea of community engagement, that's what that's really designed for, is to get that perspective. So I know you guys probably have a lot to say on this too.
The first point I don't know about shareholders, and I'm just talent, right? I'm just a journalist. But then the second part,
just
though,
a journalist.
The second part, though, about this idea of inclusion and diversity, I can be hard on journalists and journalism as a craft because we're so self-congratulatory, right? We like patting each other on the back and awards. We like to get in a press conference and see how smart you are, right? Your question, your long one, is it about the people or not, right? To me, it boils down to. But we go to a Ferguson and we'll get up there and we'll talk about, it's 60% black, and the police department there, out of 55 officers, only 2 are black. Look across the police line. Mm-hmm. Look at your newsrooms. I've been in New York and Philadelphia and Trenton and New Orleans, and I'm often the only black journalist. So even if we were getting to the place where we're checking off a box, well, let's check off some boxes, right? Because even at that, we're not getting to a space where the demographics of our newsrooms properly reflected. And you wonder why we have racist headlines and mistakes, and you're this black person and that black person, this Native American, and you can't tell the difference because there's no one in the newsroom that reflects those communities. And class is also important, right? Again, once you get outside of the cities and suburbs, it's all poor white people, right? How many poor white people are in newsrooms? Not very many, right? Because the class thing. Can you rise through all of the hurdles of life and the barriers from wherever you're from to get to this vaunted place in this tower? So there's a lot of criticism about these elites, and I wouldn't go that far, but we kind of are in so many ways, right? But how dare we point the finger at every institution without looking at ourselves? And I've said this to my bosses everywhere I go. Well, the onus can't be on the one black reporter to find you some black people to talk to,
This is true.
right? You have resources and money. Stop wringing your hands, right? And if you care about, creating a diverse atmosphere, then how about you grow your own? Why don't we go into these high schools and start programs and have staff members be mentors and, hold their hand and walk them through college. And then when they're finally ready, start them off at a small newspaper in your network, right? Or a small, whatever it is. So then you can't say that there are no people of color that are smart or trained or talented enough. Grow your own, right? We spend money. Again, I work for NBC proudly. Anybody who's watching, I love NBC Universal. But there are people in our, look at the morning show. People are making $28 million a year. You can't tell me you can't set aside $100,000 so we can set up this program in Ferguson, in Trenton, in Sacramento, wherever, and we can incorporate media literacy and what a news story is. And here's how you gather the facts. And here's the art of storytelling. And here's a nut graph. And so you can present your neighborhood through your eyes and the people's eyes. Learn how to access public records and FOIA. We can't spend money doing that when people are making $28 million a year, right? And so we wring our hands and we pat ourselves on the back and we think we're so smart and we like especially progressive liberal media organizations. Look at them. It's racism. It's white supremacy. It's privilege. Well, look at us, right? So are we reflecting our values properly? Are we even trying? And sometimes I think we are trying. I think I don't even want to say it's difficult because you're throwing money around all day, right? But again, so the diversity, I think, is reflected in our coverage. And again, when you see stories that aren't framed in the big picture, not every story warrants 1619 when black folks first arrived, but that's kind of the story. We're talking about politics and education. This is the story of race in America, right? NRA, Second Amendment, this is what it's about. Immigration, this is what it's about. Native rights and water rights, and that's what it's about, right? And so unless we have people that are reflecting these communities, and not say that, there aren't journalists who aren't of color who can't do great jobs at reporting. Certainly they can. And that's why they're there and they've been doing it, right? But I think we need to ensure that our newsrooms are diverse and make sure the stories are right, because we get it wrong a lot.
Thank you. May I stand for a second? Sorry. I know that your organization reports a lot on advocacy efforts and a lot of efforts on underrepresented populations, communities of color. Can you talk a little bit about your approach and to ensure underrepresented communities are present in the organization, but also in the reporting, and that their views and perspectives are?
I think when you're talking about underrepresented communities, there's often a challenge with those communities being able to have the skills to speak to a reporter. So I think there's a lot of grassroots organizations that have never had a communications director who have, don't even know how am I going to tell my story in a way that I can get other people to relate to it, even though they don't look like me or haven't, directly experienced eviction. Most of our reporting on land use issues. So there's definitely a socioeconomic component to the people that we're talking to. So I think a lot of it is finding organizations that have invested in advocacy, that train leaders within their organization to be spokespeople for their community, because often if they aren't trained to do that, they just feel nervous and they don't want to talk to a reporter about their personal experience. It's always a reporter's job to find that story of the person that's experienced that the policy change, what you're looking for, but that's often the challenge, is finding organizations that have trained leaders to speak out. And it's funny that you mentioned listicles again. So just kind of going back to that, social media, because we try and represent marginalized communities, and as a new organization, we do try to find ways that people will respond to the stories that we're doing. We do kind of longer investigative pieces, video features that will be like 5 to 10 minutes, which is quite long for news these days. But we do put up listicles because people read them and they're popular, and people will absorb 5 quick facts about why building luxury condos isn't going to solve the housing crisis in San Francisco, and they can absorb the 5 facts and they can move on with their day and have 5 solid talking points that they can add to the discussion. So we try and do things a little bit differently, but I think we all have the same foundations about why we're in this.
Great.
I was going to add just something that Tremayne said about grow your own. I love this idea, and NPR is investing a lot of money, and we've done the same thing. We have this program called Next Gen, and we take 5 students, or usually students are just out of college, and we pair them with a mentor. And it's not much, it's a week, but the students that we get are amazing, and it'll bring you to tears, some of their stories. We had one student last fall, great reporter, really going to do a lot. The second or third day, we couldn't figure out where he was staying. Well, he couldn't get home each day, and he didn't have money for food either. And it was one of those moments where you thought, okay, this is somebody who is actually going to make a difference in our profession. But look at the hurdles that people like this have, and we've got to do something, because otherwise, again, we won't get those kinds of stories. We won't have the ability to have the language, the understanding, the depth that just comes with living. And so I think that's a big part of, if you want to call it, the grow your own or however. But I think that's one of the solutions we're trying to figure out. How do we bring people up that have so many challenges? Yeah.
I was just going to say that, it did remind me of the fact that, when you're starting off as a journalist, often you're an unpaid intern. You kind of have to pay your dues. And how many people from marginalized communities can spend 40 hours a day in a newsroom just not getting paid instead of, when I had to do my internship after my master's, I actually had to do my stories for my paid job during my internship because I had to finish the story so I could get paid. There's not a lot of people that can take that time off from a paying gig, especially if you're talking about wanting more representation from different classes, from different communities. So definitely having the larger organizations pay their interns, look for people that can make a living out of, even if you're just beginning.
I was going to say the same thing. It's a sin not to pay your interns.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
how can you get someone to move to the city and support themselves? Because you really are not just changing their life and the world because of their skills and talents, but a generational line, right? Give someone skills. And we talk about this in other industries. If we can give people the skills to actually have a meaningful career and pay, support yourself and pay for, food for your children, it's an amazing thing.
Yeah. Well, I want to, before we move into questions, just want to thank the panelists, and as lively as the lunch discussion, provocative and meaningful. So please join me in thanking the panelists. We have a lot of questions. How much time do I have, Sam? 15. So some of them we addressed.
Speed dating.
Speed dating. I was thinking of just sitting them out. You get your own question, but some of them we've addressed. So I moved on a little bit. But this first question, I hope we have time maybe for at least 3 questions, Sam. So, this part about community engaged reporting. So what is community engaged reporting? Can you provide some examples of that? And we have a lot of advocates in the room, and they're trying to build partnerships with media. And you mentioned earlier about you have that fine line between reporting and being an advocate. And so I'm sure you've been approached by many folks in this room trying to push their story or their information, and in many cases push public policy. And so how do you define community engaged reporting? What does a community or a nonprofit organization or a coalition need to know to help drive a story so that it might get on the list of a story that you'd want to cover?
Well, for those of you, and obviously here in this area, if you go to our website, capradio.org, there's a really good write-up about our community engagement. And I know there's a few organizations here that we actually work with. But for us, it simply is that. It's developing a relationship with an organization who has intimate knowledge of whatever is going on in the specific topic that we're talking about. So whether it's food deserts here in the city, housing, that's the one we're working on now. And so for us, it's not necessarily a community organization pitching us a story. It's us saying, okay, this is a topic that we want to work on. We're going to work on it for a year. We're going to start researching it. We're going to send our community engagement strategist out, and she's going to begin to make inroads with the different organizations to just get information, so that we can begin to help our reporters understand the ground level of the topic. And then we obviously go and we research the policies and all of that. But, it's the community groups who are actually doing the hard work. And so that's a lot of times where we start to begin to get our information and begin to understand where the problems are. And then we'll spend a lot of time, we'll spend the entire cycle of our reporting checking back in and having convenings. We had a convening with the Milken Institute. What was this, a couple weeks ago? We brought in a lot of people and had these discussions about housing and policymakers and folks that are affected and advocacy groups. So it's really, it's pretty encompassing, and I don't want to take all the time, but if they're interested, they can read. And other media organizations have their own definition of community engagement. So this is one that we've spent a lot of time on, and some of the other public media organizations have modeled theirs after ours. So it's a great model, actually, and it's probably a good model for just community organizations to be looking at when they want to reach out to a media organization and figure out how could we work together. But yeah, it's a tough balance. It really is.
Thank you for that, Linnea.
Let me talk about that for just a moment. For those of you who are in these kinds of organizations, make yourselves available. list something on your website where a reporter who may have a breaking story that is then going to develop into something can find an expert in what it is that you all do. There used to be this great book that came out once a year. It was called it was a list of experts in almost any field that you could find, and every newsroom had one. And a building fell down, I need an engineer. And you'd find a structural engineer and you'd call them up and say, hey, I saw you were included in this book, and you're off to the races. I don't think that book is published anymore because the internet has changed so much. But if you have people who have expertise, get them out there. Make it easy for a reporter to contact them when they're on deadline for one story, and then they're building the source relationship, because we all do it. Everybody we talk to. They go in the phone, they go in a spreadsheet with a phone number and an email and a little line about what it is that they do and how they can help. And their willingness to talk to a journalist. You know who does a great job at this? Law schools.
Yes.
Stanford and UC Berkeley, you can find, they trip over themselves to get an expert on criminal law or internet law or housing law available to talk to a reporter in a hurry. And then the reporters end up going back to them. And it builds something to a point where maybe the law school doesn't pitch a story, but maybe when you get to know a reporter because you've had your expert talk to them, it feels more organic to the reporter. The BS meter doesn't go off as much as perhaps if it comes straight out of the PR department. And that's a good two-way engagement.
Also, I think it's important for reporters, especially on like local beat reporters and their editors, to spend some time in the community where you're not busy breaking news. Go to the neighborhood. When I was a local reporter, I would find the local activists. I would go to the church. I would spend time in the neighborhood so that we can actually build a genuine kind of relationship. You can't always do that. On the other side, it's always helpful when, if you say, you're working in a situation in Texas, they're incarcerating juveniles, do you have a family or two to get me started? One, we're busy or lazy or combination. But if you have people that can, again, looking for that character, if you have a mom who may put herself through college and whatever the story is, it helps and you have access to the people because you guys are working on the front lines with the people. Mm-hmm. So you should always have on deck a handful of people. So if there any media comes up, you already talk to them, give them the basics of how to deal with the media, and then it provides an easier way to tell the story if we don't have time to go into the community and find someone ourselves. Mm-hmm. Or at least it gives you a good start. But that's the easier way, and especially being able to build a kind of a relationship, mm-hmm. not just calling them with the easy pitch, but hey, I'm so-and-so, here's what I do, we'd love to grab some coffee or something sometime, and then you can actually build that, mm-hmm. Connection.
Thank you.
Yeah, completely agree with those. I think it's important for a reporter to be a traditional beat reporter and to develop those relationships. I think also you could maximize on any press conference that you hold by knowing how to write a good press release, having, that, as Tremayne said, that character already quoted in your press release, that the person in the community that is directly affected, and having the contact information for that person. It's challenging because they're just a normal person, they're not a spokesperson, but kind of getting to the point where you're being willing, that person is willing to share their contact information, having, somebody on staff that knows how to talk with media, is available, has contact information, and also because just writing your press release in a way that basically mimics an article, because oftentimes you have journalists who are on time constraints that will basically publish your press release. Honestly, it's not a good thing to do, but if you want to get in the media, and you write a good press release, that's what PR people do, kind of get to that level yourself.
And if you have time and the ability, it always feels good when it's kind of exclusive, right? So if you're telling me, hey, Tremayne, I got this thing, it's embargoed until Tuesday at midnight, but if you want something ahead of time, I can do that. So now I'll be more willing to do it if you send it to me and CNN, and everyone's gonna have the same people. But if you can say, let me know now if you're in position to do something. If not, I'll just send it out there. And then it feels like, oh, that's nice of you. Thank you very much. But also, again, the likelihood of getting a fully fleshed out story. That's,
Mm-hmm. I have time for one more question, Sam. So have you ever been involved in a story that changed your personal point of view?
Well, my
I don't know who wrote the question, but
That's a good question.
well, my first story changed my view of the importance of journalism, or kind of made me realize the importance of it. I was working for a ethnic press publication in Toronto, and it was focused on the Filipino community. And it was my first ever, there was just like, go out there and report on this report by the government. It's like news kind of article, but then I found out all of these things, reading between the lines, that, hey, the government of Canada wasn't treating Filipinos in this living caregiver program, nanny immigration program, basically, mostly dominated by Filipinos. They weren't treating them fairly, and that's basically what I reported. I quoted the article and, everything like that. And the immigration minister, the federal immigration minister for Canada, actually wrote a letter to the editor in response to my first ever article. And that's when I realized, like, oh my God, I just published something that, this big top guy actually responded to, and his response was, of course we care about Filipinos. Like, how can you say that? I mean, that's not what I wrote, but, and then I had people from the community saying, that's exactly how I feel about the way the government has been treating us in the particular program. And, in that way, I kind of realized, it's not just writing an essay for school that only my professor is going to read. It's in the public realm. It can actually impact policy. And so that changed the way that I look at, journalism, and the way that I try and use the power that I have as a journalist to communicate to the world, to communicate to power.
Power of media.
I think I had and it didn't necessarily change the way I thought, but it kind of offered a lot of nuance. I had an opportunity over the last 2 years to team up with a photographer named Matt Black, who, this guy is a Magnum photographer. This guy is one of the best in the business, period. But we set out for this project called the Geography of Poverty, right? And so we were very intentional about going all across the country and finding communities where from politics to geography to industry collapsing to race to class, all that creates this situation where it kind of reinforces the state that people are in of poverty and all the barriers to opportunity that they have. And so we were intentional about also carving up between race, right? So the first story was down by the Texas-Mexico border in Brownsville, to talk about poverty and race there. And everywhere we went, the community had to have 20% or more of the population in poverty. So he actually drove to 78 different cities. I would parachute in by region. So one, seeing America like this, going to Brownsville, Texas, going to Cancer Alley. It's a stretch of 100 or so miles between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, where the plantations had been set up. Black people still live, but that's also where the refineries are set up. So people are dying of all kind of mysterious diseases, and the schools are on brownfield. It's terrible. To go to Flint, again, much like Michael Brown in Ferguson, going to Flint before the lead crisis to talk about what happened when GM closed. You have all these poor white people. We had a strong kind of white working class, middle class that just collapsed. And then people were complaining about the lead and the poverty and everything. Going to Standing Rock and Pine Ridge Reservation to talk about, I have friends out there, and once you're out there, you realize how isolated this community is, how they are, but also how America, we've broken every single treaty that we've ever had, and they have no recourse. And we've systematically tried to destroy them. And to see how people are surviving and striving in some cases, but also, I visited a 6th grade class where 6 kids had already committed suicide. And this was like in the winter of the year, so towards the end of the year, 6 children committed suicide. Well, life expectancy for men is like 41, and for women it's older, like 52 or something like that. But to go from city to city and then go to Philadelphia to look at the impact of mass incarceration in the black community, right? And go to Lorain, Ohio, look at the collapse of the steel industry. And again, similar to Flint, that white working class, but also black folks who had came up from the South to work in these plants, right? So what happened in these communities? So to see America across the spectrum with poverty and policy and how we haven't fulfilled, the promises of America. And again, it's so tribal, and it's about resources. And so I kind of get perturbed when people say it's class, not race, but there is a class issue. It's a poverty issue against the powerful and the powerless. And that's really what we're wrestling with. And clearly, there's nuance in between all the cracks of race and the indigenous people who are already here. How one guy told me, we didn't cross the border crossed us kind of thing. But I think it really opened my eyes that what we're up against and that it's intentional and it's maintained because we erect policy to maintain it, right? Every step along the way, whether it's redlining or whatever it is, we, as Ta-Nehisi Coates said, the balance of white supremacy will always right itself. So you have Barack Obama, and here you go again. And in that, it comes class, right? So people are manipulated in all kinds of ways. All these poor white folks are going to lose all of their benefits and lose everything. And so we start getting to the core of it, that, again, it's intentional and intentionally maintained. I think it's frightening, and it's terrible, and that they were continue to be cleaved apart from each other. When more than anything, and it sounds cliche and kumbaya, but we really should be kind of coming together because there are powers at work against us. I think that project kind of like really opened my eyes to that.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Thomas?
I said before, I mentioned I worked in Atlantic City for a while, and when I went there, I kind of thought, wow, casinos, this will be cool. And I can tell you that I left there with the idea that government-sanctioned legal gambling as public policy and a revenue stream is one of the single worst public policies in the country. And when I was there, the explosion had not happened of casinos everywhere. They dreaded it in Atlantic City because they knew that it would pretty much kill them off, which it mostly has done when they put casinos in New York, in Philadelphia, all up and down the Eastern Corridor, and of course all over the country now. And it's just, I think that was one public policy thing that really awakened me to, the desperation of people, the fact that it feeds on poor, less educated people who think that they go to these places and have a chance, that it makes them become compulsive in the gambling. It's just, it was a horrible public policy. I can't speak sharply enough against it. And we see it in California now with, all these tribes. And the irony of California, the California Constitution says that gambling is illegal in our state, which state is the largest gambling state in the country, because the Native American tribes are exempt from the state requirement on it. It's just horrible public policy, completely changed my mind about it.
Renee, last word.
That's frightening, right? I come from a family of lettuce pickers. I really do. I was first generation college student. So I would like to say that I've seen or reported on something that changed my point of view. I think the closest I can get to actually having something like, oh, that's something I didn't expect, was when I covered the space shuttle program for a couple of years. Patriotism has never been a thing in my background, and yet that was the one thing that I remember being at NASA for those 2 years, off and on, and seeing just people from all different countries and walks of life, and kids coming there to watch the shuttle launch, college students who have worked on projects that are going to go up and into space, and then the astronauts, and then just this idea of teamwork and a group effort on something that is gone away. That to me was something that I didn't expect. As far as journalism changing my perspective, I just keep digging, because I'm inspired by people and their stories, and I think it might be because I have such a, there's some unique things in my background, and they don't surprise me anymore, but I'm always looking for that next thing, that next, turn that next rock over, pick up that shiny object and spin it around and see what it is. So I think the curiosity is still there.
Well, please join me in thanking an incredible all your insights, your thoughts, and for those of you who can stay with me a little bit, we would really appreciate it. And thank you to the audience.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.